Hello, this is our review for Unit 4A, which is over motivation, emotion, and personality. Our first big topic is the five-factor model of personality. The factors or personality traits form the acronym CANOE, or you can also reorder them to spell ocean. And people score at different levels of each of those traits. The first is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness, people who are conscientious tend to be hardworking, well-organized, and punctual, whereas low on conscientiousness tends to be lazy, disorganized, sometimes late. The next one is agreeableness. With agreeableness, people who score high on agreeableness tend to be trusting, good-natured, and pretty kind and lenient, whereas people who score lower tend to be more suspicious, easily irritated, and pretty critical. The next one is neuroticism. People who score high on neuroticism tend to worry a lot, tend to be self-conscious and more emotional, anxious. And then people who score lower on neuroticism tend to be more calm, comfortable, less emotional, more even-tempered. And then the fifth one, openness to experience. People who score high on openness to experience tend to be more imaginative, creative, curious, and people who are lower on openness to experience tend to be down-to-earth, conventional, less curious. And I misspoke. The last one is extroversion. Extroversion, people who are more extroverted tend to be joiners, talkative, active, and the people who score lower on extroversion tend to be more of the loners, quiet, and more reserved. Again, trait theorists believe that those traits tend to be enduring over time. The next, our first of the theories of emotion is the Cannon-Bard theory, which I reminded you to not focus so much on the names of the people who did them, but more on what the theories are about. So that is the simultaneous theory, because with that one, the physiological response and the cognitive appraisal happen at the same time. So a lot of times people may have a cognitive response that doesn't match their physiological feelings. So for example, they may be crying, but they're not actually sad. That's just their body's response. Ledoux's high road and low road theory of motion says that we have a quick and dirty low road response, which is our physiological response that goes straight through the amygdala. But then we also have a slower high road response that goes through the cortex, which allows us to think and process what's going on in a situation. Lazarus's appraisal theory. This one, again, and this is a situation where you'd have more time to experience the situation. With this one, the person has first appraises it as a threat or a challenge, and they consider what resources they have and how much of a threat or of a challenge it is, and they do a secondary appraisal to determine if it really is dangerous or if it's something that they'll be okay with. The defense mechanisms, these are part of Freudian psychoanalytic theory, and these are distortions of reality made by the ego in order to preserve itself when it's having difficulty trying to balance between the id and the superego. With rationalization, a person is trying to give themselves believable excuses for why they may not have been the way they wanted to. So for example, somebody who fails a test may rationalize it by saying, well, those questions shouldn't have been on the test, or my teacher was gone for so long that we shouldn't have even taken the test yet. With projection, you are placing feelings that you feel about yourself onto others. So if I am jealous of somebody, I may say, they're just jealous of me, when in reality, I'm the one who's jealous of them. Displacement is similar in that you're projecting, but in this case, you're projecting your feelings not onto the true source, but onto somebody else, often somebody you consider weaker. So for example, if your boss at work, you're mad at your boss, but you're not going to yell back to your boss. So instead, you respond to your younger sibling and you're rude to them. That would be displacement. With fantasy, in this one, a person ignores or avoids reality. So somebody who, instead of doing their classwork, spends the entire period scrolling through social media, that would be an example of fantasy. Sublimation is the channeling of unacceptable feelings into something more productive. So for example, many people channel their feelings about society into their art. Repression is the unconscious forcing of feelings into the unconscious mind. Again, this happens without the person's realization, where they are forgetting the bad things that happened because they have now pushed them into their unconscious mind. Again, they do it unconsciously. With reaction formation, the person shows the opposite feeling of what they actually feel. So unconsciously, they dislike a person, but they may be overly friendly in real life. Denial is a person's failure to accept or believe reality. So if somebody failed a test, if they kept saying they didn't believe that was their score, no, I didn't fail. No, I didn't fail. That wasn't my grade. That would be denial. Regression is when a person reverts to a younger age. So they may throw temper tantrums. They won't accept their responsibilities, but they're acting like a younger age. Intellectualization, instead of experiencing the emotions that go with the situation, a person will focus on the details. We talked about the trauma of an accident, where instead of somebody focuses on dealing with the loss of a loved one, instead they focus on all the details of a car accident, about the other driver, how fast they were going, the weather conditions. They intellectualize the situation. And then finally, compensation. Freud said that people who felt weakness in one area will often compensate for it in another. So somebody who may feel inferior about their grades may instead throw all of their energy into their other school activities, even though they shouldn't be spending so much time on those activities. So it could be like sublimation, but maybe they're spending so much time on their makeup to compensate for their lack of good grades. All right, those are the defense mechanisms. Display rules, this comes with how we show emotions and just the idea that cultures vary in how they show their emotions. One of the examples that's often discussed is that in Asian culture, publicly, people do not show their emotions freely the same way they would at home or in private. The evolutionary theories of emotion state that many of our fears are leftover survival mechanisms from our earlier ancestors. Things like fear of snakes, fear of the dark. Those were dangerous to early ancestors who lived outside. So a lot of environmental conditions are evolutionary threats. External versus internal environmental hunger cues. So an external environmental hunger cue would be like you feel hungry because you see candy in a bowl on a table. An internal hunger cue would be you feel hungry because your stomach actually hurts. In the Schachter experiment on hunger, he found that people who were overweight tended to base their hunger more on external cues, and people who were of healthy weight tended to base their hunger cues more on internal cues. The id, ego, superego, these are part of Freud's personality theory. He said that our personality is divided into three parts. The ego is the conscious part of our personality. And it mediates between the id and the superego. The id is what develops first. It's our primitive, infant, childlike part of our personality. It's playful, but also irresponsible. It shouldn't take over, or at first it's dominant, but over time it should be a weaker part of our personality. The superego develops as we grow in morals and understanding of the rules of society. So the superego is to help keep us in check as well. If the id is too strong, somebody may be too spontaneous, too playful, not willing to accept responsibility. If the superego is too strong, somebody may be too rigid, too strict with rules, but also too worrisome as they're overly cautious all the time. Carl Rogers' self-theory, this is one of the humanistic trait theories. Personality theory is the idea that people have more control over themselves, so kind of the opposite of psychoanalytic theory. Carl Rogers talked a lot about how we have different levels of ourself. We have our ideal self, our self-image, and our true self, and when those are not aligned, we call that incongruence, and that can create tension within our personality. So ideally, we would like our different versions of ourselves all to align. Internal versus external locus of control refers to how much we feel we have control of our own lives and our situations. Internal locus control means you believe that you can do it. I believe that I have control over my own destiny. External locus of control believes that external factors like fate, the government, my boss, everybody else except me controls what's happening in my life. The James Longa theory of emotion, we call it the physio-first theory. This is one of the earliest explanations of emotion. But this one says that we first, when confronted with an emotion-producing stimulus, or emotion stimulus, that we, that we first have a physiological response, like our heart rate goes up, and then our emotion is actually in response to the physiological feeling in our body. So, for example, if you see a scary dog, your heart rate goes up, and then you're feeling fear, not to the dog, but you feel fear because you recognize that your heart rate is up. The broaden and build theory of emotion is the newest of all of the theories of emotion, and it emphasizes the impact of positive emotions. So positive emotions form the foundation of our emotions, and it helps us to broaden our perspective and build better personal connections with others, whereas negative emotions tend to cut those connections off. The lateral and ventromedial hypothalamuses have to do with motivation of hunger. The lateral side of the hypothalamus is what turns hunger on. Remember I said lateral, fateral, because lateral, if it turns it on, you'll get fatter. But if you were to destroy the lateral hypothalamus, you would starve because your hunger would never be turned on. The ventromedial hypothalamus is what tells us that we are full. So we're closing the food vent, or you're telling us that we're very full. If we were to destroy the ventromedial hypothalamus, you would overeat and become very overweight because you would never feel full, so you would never stop eating. The Schachter two-factor theory of personality says that first, so it's very similar into the simultaneous Cannon-Bard theory, except it's not all happening at the same time. Instead, it's happening in a sequence. That we see the scary dog, our heart rate goes up, that's physiological. We have a cognitive appraisal, like that dog could hurt me, and then you feel the emotion of, I better get out of here, of fear. So it has all the same steps as the simultaneous theory, but they're in sequential order instead of at the same time. Self-efficacy is similar to self-esteem, but it's not just believing in yourself broadly. It's a very specific type of self-esteem, in that self-efficacy believes that in a specific situation, you have the belief that you can be successful due to lots of factors, including that you have past evidence that proves you've done well. You've been able to see others through vicarious learning, that you just generally have confidence and you know you can perform well. There was something else I was going to add, and now I cannot remember what it is, but self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is not a personality trait, because we know that personality traits tend to endure across all situations and all scenarios, whereas self-efficacy has to do with a specific event or a specific situation, so that it's not enduring. It's in this situation, you could do well. Like in AP Psych, you know you can do well on your AP exam. AP Physics, it may be another case. So self-efficacy has to do with specific situations. Social cognitive theory of personality, that was led by Bandura, and this ties in here with reciprocal determinism, but it's the idea that the environment plus your interpretation or your cognitive thoughts about the environment are what influence your personality. Reciprocal determinism says there's three things that kind of bounce off each other to affect your personality. And those are your cognitive thoughts, your actual behaviors, and your environment. So all of those things work together to influence your personality. When it comes to measuring personality, we can do personality inventories, which are the long questions tests that you did in class, or there are projective personality tests, which are things like the TAT and the Rorschach test. TAT was a thematic apperception test. That's the one where they would show them pictures and people would tell stories about it, and that would reveal their motivations and their personality. And the Rorschach, they look at ink blots and describe what they see. Those are considered projective personality tests because you are projecting what you think and feel onto the test. The drive reduction theory, this is another motivation theory. This is the primary biological and physiological theory. It says that our body is constantly trying to get back to homeostasis. That's where it feels physiologically in balance. So when you're hungry, you eat. You're thirsty, you drink. You're cold, you seek warmth. That anytime you're out of homeostasis, you have a drive to get back to normal. The Yerkes-Dodson law is sometimes called the inverted U hypothesis. This is the one that says the best level of arousal is a moderate level of arousal. That if your arousal is too high, then you can be anxious and worrisome and you can't focus on the task. If your arousal level is too low, that you may be sleepy and unfocused. So moderate arousal is best. The incentive theory emphasizes intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic is doing something just for the joy of it, that you internally like it. Extrinsic is doing it for an outer reward, like getting paid. The optimal arousal theory, there's two sides to this. One level of the theory says that everybody has a different level of preferred peak arousal, and that satisfies their motivation. The other version of the theory talks about that if a task is very easy, a high level of motivation is good, like defensive linemen or offensive linemen, that they're just trying to push, so a high level of arousal is good. But if a task is very difficult, then a lower level of arousal is good. And then finally, 3 types of conflicts faced. With an approach, the conflict is between 2 desirable options. With avoidance, the conflict is between 2 undesirable options. And then approach avoidance, there are good and bad about both options. All right, that's it for our Unit 4A test review.